Depth and complexity is a framework that includes 11 different prompts, and its purpose is to move our students from thinking like beginners to thinking more like experts. Not just knowing more, but thinking differently. Consider your own career as a teacher. I'm sure you've heard a non educator say something like, to fix education, all we need to do is, and then list some unhelpful idea that anyone with even 1 day of teaching experience would know is impossible. As an experienced teacher, you understand your field differently than an outsider would. Just as an experienced firefighter or cardiologist or janitor or basketball player understands their field differently than an outsider. So let's look at how depth and complexity fits in with an expert educator's experience. There are 11 prompts of depth and complexity, and we're going to hit them all here in a minute or two. Imagine you're at a staff meeting and your boss starts using some acronyms and education lingo. This is language of the discipline, words that experts understand but a beginner would be baffled by. She's explaining a new district initiative. There's a discussion about how this initiative intersects with neuroscience and a need for physical movement. This is going across the disciplines. Our field is intertwined with other experts' fields. But you recognize that this initiative is very different from the initiative from a few years ago. You're noting how your field is changing over time. A beginner wouldn't have this context, but you spot it right away. You also note some dilemmas that this initiative will pose. These are ethical issues. What new problems will this idea lead to? How do the pros and cons balance out? You might even note that this isn't the first time your bosses have switched directions after a few years. In fact, you think this has become a pattern, an idea that repeats over and over within a field. You also spot that this initiative might violate some union rules, but because you know the hierarchy, that's also a rule, you won't say anything right now. You think about how kids and parents will view this initiative differently, and you might also note how teachers will think about it differently from administrators. In this way, you're thinking with multiple perspectives. As you consider the small facts about this initiative, these are the details, you consider whether or not it matches your purpose or big idea for even being a teacher. You wonder whether the current trend is headed in a positive or negative direction. You're left with more questions than you started with about how this will all work out. And these are your unanswered questions. So those are the 11 prompts of depth and complexity. I think of them as different lenses to help you focus on different parts of an idea. Each lens you put on a camera reveals new things about the subject that you're photographing. The prompts of depth and complexity will do the same. They'll reveal new things about the content that your students are studying. You probably use these lenses all the time in your own thinking without even realizing it. And that's because these prompts of depth and complexity came out of interviews with experts across many different fields. Sandra Kaplan and Betty Gould back in the 1990s wanted to understand how experts think differently than beginners about their area of expertise. And through many interviews, they arrived at these 11 tools as common ideas they saw across various fields. So a doctor is going to use language of their discipline and consider the ethical issues or how their field has changed over time. A basketball player is going to use language of their discipline. They're going to consider the rules and the ethics and how their sport has changed over time. And we can bring these to any subject that we're teaching in school. All of these are different lenses we can use to go deeper into our own subject matter and move our students closer to an expert's way of thinking. And before we go, these graphical icons you've seen simply serve as a visual shortcut, a cue that students should be thinking in a certain way. Just like each of these symbols made you think of certain jobs, these symbols will make students think using one of the 11 lenses. You'll see how it works in upcoming videos. Now, there are lots of variations on these icons. The way they look isn't the point, it's that they trigger a certain way of thinking. I like to use emojis since they're so darn convenient and fun, but in the old days, I just sketched them by hand on my overhead projector. And by the way, your kids should be using these icons as they get familiar with depth and complexity. While you're certainly going to use these, they're really students' tools that they can use to go deeper into content. So we're going to take a break here so that you can browse this PDF with definitions and sample questions using each prompt. And then in the following videos, we'll go deeper into the prompts of depth and complexity.